Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, Ontario, and I'm a journalist, and I make coffee, and I sell comic books to people, and I make this podcast, and I pet my cats.
I'm Matt. I teach media studies and cultural theory at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are media theory, cultural studies, media archaeology. Still loving that one. And for the next 2 weeks, very specifically, my interests are drinking a lot of coffee, teaching a class about coffee. So that's wild.
Nice.
Really jittery.
I'm teaching that class every day. Every day of my life.
Yeah, man, you're an expert on it.
Yeah, but still, the tipping, I gotta say, even though I mentioned it several weeks ago, Canadians continue to be bad coffee tippers, but it's fine. Minimum wage is going up here, so whatever. They can get a pass on it.
That's so awesome. I'm actually doing a little bit tomorrow on the stuff happening with Tim Hortons, and I think that my students will be very interested to know that the Fight for 15 worked in Canada, and they won.
We won it. We won
so that's
it.
Awesome.
Won that fight. Yep, gonna have $15 for every hour that I work by the end of, I think it's like this year or something. I don't know. All the details aren't clear to me, which I should probably follow more closely. Mostly I just am like, yes, we should have it. So that's pretty cool. Yep. Anyway,
good job, Canadian activists and Tim Hortons. Get your act together. Stop being so crappy.
Right. Yeah, don't be so crappy. So this week on the podcast, we don't have any goofs to make because it is a really long conversation ahead with John Thornton Jr. Long but good, worth it, worth your time. And we also don't have any iTunes reviews, which is not our fault. I mean, I don't want to make the listeners bummed out or anything, but like, it's kind of their responsibility. They're really shirking it lately in the new year. So anyway, berating your audience is actually a really good way to start a podcast. I think that's a good listener strategy.
Yeah, all the media blogs say you got to make sure you belittle and make fun of people who listen to your podcast.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. Actually, well, here's something we should say. We got some new Patreon supporters, like several new ones in the last few weeks, and that's really exciting and cool. And we don't thank people enough for supporting us that way, and it lets us give buttons and make cool t-shirts and pay people when they make cool stuff for us, like Amaria's intro that she did. So yeah, I mean, that's a great thing. Anyway, there's no good segue here other than to say thanks a bunch, and also thanks to John Thornton Jr. for talking to us about being a pastor, being a socialist pastor, and a bunch of fascinating stuff about debt. So you're our first guest of the new year, John Thornton Jr. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I'm pumped. I feel like this is we're getting things started right. It feels like 2018, really doing it.
That's
right, really doing it. That's
2018, really doing it. Yeah, man, it's a good tagline, I think.
the sequel to Nike.
Just do it, really doing it.
How's the year been going for you, John? What have you been up to in this first couple of weeks of January?
I was about to say just settling in, which sounds like this is the lamest. I think I was on vacation with my family for a little while. That was nice. Yeah, I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen in 2018? Probably some more dead celebrities that we all love. That's going to probably happen. Yeah.
Probably.
Is there anyone that you want to vote off the island this year?
Yeah. I got into a dead pool of celebrities. I tried to figure out who's going down this year. No, I've been kind of looking ahead as far as I do feel like I've settled into a place where I can look at the things I want to read about and think about and write about and what matters, and am
Nice.
actually kind of plotting out a course for doing that, which is not something I've ever done. So 2018, the year of books. Just a lot of books.
Just getting it done. 2018.
20 liter 18.
20 liter 18 is, oh dang, that's great. It's like NaNoWriMo, but all year.
That's right. No. I was trying to think of how to end that with an ano thing.
It's nothing.
It doesn't,
yeah,
no.
It's nothing.
It's over. I'm sorry, everyone. I apologize. Year names have just been on my brain lately. I turned in my dissertation proposal, which was really exciting, and so I'm calling this year 20 Dissertate Teen. I'm gonna finish it. It's
a good one. That's a good name.
I think so.
Congrats.
Not universally applicable, but
congrats on that, though. That's very cool.
Yeah, thank you. I'm pretty pumped about it. So see how that goes.
Yeah, nice. I've been teaching this class. We have a thing here called interterm, and it's like a 2-week crazy intensive where we do a class in 2 weeks, and it's nuts. But I've been co-teaching this class on coffee and cultural studies, and it's been really fun. So drinking a lot of coffee. There's nothing quite like getting really jacked up on caffeine and then giving a lecture to 25 undergrads. It's just a real rush.
It sounds like a rush.
Yeah, it's great.
You gotta constrict those blood vessels in your brain to lecture for 5 hours a day.
Yeah, it's really only like 4 hours a day, but it's a lot.
Only 4, so
yeah,
easy. That's cool. Well, it's a good year. 2018, 20 liter 18, 20 dissertate teen.
Just doing it. We're just
just doing it. 20 caffeinate 18.
Ooh, 20 caffeinate. 20 caffeinate teen. Just doing it.
Just doing it. Really doing it. Here we are. We're really doing this podcast. Pretty pumped about it. So I guess if you've listened to this podcast for an extremely long time, thank you, I guess, first of all. But secondly, you'll recognize John Thornton Jr. already, because we had him on the show in the baby stages, when we were just learning how to crawl, when we were dunking on Rod Dreher back in the day. And John Thornton Jr. helped us out because we didn't read his book, didn't read Rod Dreher's book, and John did. So he made sure to tell us what was really up, what was really going on with the Benedict option. And here we are.
It's actually the only book I read in 2017. I just kept rereading it. I just kept going back.
What other books do you need? There's just
a lot of stuff to go back to. It really
lots to unpack
rewards a
there, yeah.
rereading.
It's the kind of book that, like, in 100 years, it's going to be a classic on every Christian shelf. It's the mere Christianity of our time.
It didn't even last through Trump's election as a relevant book.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'm really glad that you're finding so much material to just keep pouring over in Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option. All right, well, there you go. That's the perspective of this podcast. Real Dreher heads over here. Instead of talking about that, though, we're going to talk about the religious left. And I think that it's appropriate to start this year off talking to you, John, since you're a pastor, for folks who don't know. I guess I'll let you introduce yourself in a second. I don't want to speak for you, but I do want to say one reason it's exciting to have you on is we do a lot of stuff on the show talking about, like, books that we're reading, or talking to academics that think really hard about ideas and concepts in other countries or whatever. But we don't actually spend that much time thinking about, like, actually going to church, like being a regular Christian person in regular Christian circles and worlds and practices. So I think it's a nice kind of change of pace to actually get a chance to chat with someone whose literal job it is to to think about how to kind of navigate these spaces. So yeah, I guess maybe for folks who don't know you, John, could you describe a little bit about yourself? What do you do? What's up, and why did you become a pastor?
Yeah, that last question's a big one. But my name is John Thornton Jr. And I am an associate pastor of youth, missions, adults, and other duties as assigned at First Baptist Church on 5th Street in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I've been here for about 8 months. Before that was a pastoral resident at a church in Greensboro. And so that's kind of where I am. So really, like a third of my job is, or my job is divided up into thirds of youth, missions, and adults, with that latter one being a focus on young adults, which is kind of where a lot of my leftism comes in. But you asked about, like, why did I become a pastor, right? I think a lot of it is just my commitment to the church. Because I don't know, like, one, just like people wanted me to be a pastor, and that seemed like a good thing to do, which is like, well, okay, this seems pretty all right. But yeah, so I grew up in suburban Dallas. My dad's a pastor. Actually, the pastor that I grew up under, for like the first, I don't know, like 6-7 years, where I was growing up, became the president of the Southern Baptist.
Dang.
Jimmy Draper. Yeah. So obviously a long heritage of leftism and political activism.
Yeah, you got that red phone at home, straight to the president.
Right. Yeah, but I grew up in church. A lot of it was my dad was a minister. My dad was a minister of evangelism at the church I was growing up in, and his life, like, kind of bottomed out right before he became a Christian in his mid-20s, and I always grew up with this sense that, like, very real, that church exists to meet people when they are at their worst, and to provide a better way forward. And then I saw that, like, in a leadership sense in my dad's ministry. And that just always clicked with me. So church, like, always made sense as a community. I had, like, a lot of good friends, and had a lot of fun in church, but it also, there was this idea that, when things are bad, you go to church and they will make them not as bad. Like, it's a group of people that will work together. And through, like, college, that I took on more, like, leadership positions, and turned out I was, like, pretty good at getting people together and moving people to live in a way together that maybe embodied, like, what Jesus wanted for people, and that also, like, kind of tapped into this place where if things are wrong or hard, like, this is the group you go to. And so that then led to Duke Divinity School and ordination at the church that I was at in Greensboro, and now I'm a pastor. It's weird to me too. That's how I talk about whenever I introduce myself to people, like, outside the church. I say, like, I'm a Baptist minister, and it's weird to me too.
Yeah, it is kind of weird and interesting. So you grew up in the church, you were a PK, so there's a lot of stuff going on there. Interesting that you, like, kind of come out of, I mean, Baptists aren't all, like, you know, reactionary conservatives, but some of them are. But it's, like, interesting that
a very solid number.
Yeah. I don't want to make any sweeping generalizations, but yeah, like, mostly. But it's, like, interesting that you kind of came out of that background, and, like, that family background, and now you're a pastor yourself, and you're on Twitter, and your name on Twitter is Mark Driscoll. So, I guess, how did you? I think a question that's probably just as important and probably just as difficult to answer. How did you become a socialist?
Yeah. So I always wanted to, like, figure out how things work. Like, I wanted to like figure out why things were the way they were, and so maybe some of that's just the fact that I'm, like, I can be deeply insecure, and so, like, if someone I want to know why I am the way that I am, and why my friends are the way that they are, and hubris always really bothered me. Like, just the sort of arrogance, and I would see that particularly directed at people that were poor, and like, not accepting these easy answers. So then, like, you got to figure out why these things are the way they are. Why are people treating one another in this way? And and my church put me in positions where I was around people that were impoverished, where I was like seeing poverty up close, going on like mission trips and things like that. But I never settled for the sort of like easy answers, or I didn't want to settle for the easy answers. And so, so that led me to then question, like, well, I've always like thought if 35 random people are doing the same thing, there must be something else going on than just they're all making the same decision at the same time. So there must be some sort of answer beyond that. So that led me to question systems, right? Like, why are people acting this way? Why are these outcomes happening? And then like Occupy was really big. I don't know if that was that for y'all? Like,
yeah,
right.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
yeah. I mean, it was this moment
thing
where like all of this. I'd been on these mission trips. I was working with in an after-school program with like kids in poverty. But that was this moment where it just blew everything to a grander scale. And then I read Marx Capital and David Graeber's book Debt right before divinity school, and those kind of gave an intellectual foundation for being a socialist. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. It feels very similar to my own kind of path as well. It's interesting the way that you sort of articulated it as being a Christian kind of put you in proximity with people who were suffering and people in poverty. And there's something about Christianity that kind of puts you in those situations, but then not many Christians sort of ask deeper questions about why this problem exists that they have to address. And I felt sort of the same way, right? Like I had this intuitive sense that like, well, Christians have to care about the poor. That's what Jesus is all about. It seems like that's what the Bible's about. And the longer you kind of engage that, the more you're, I guess, if you take it seriously, I think the more you're sucked into asking questions about why people are poor and not just questions about like how you, I don't know, fix them up and send them on their way or something. Occupy was a big deal for me too. I don't know. I went to an evangelical school when Occupy was happening. That was like a pretty huge thing for me anyway. I don't know. What about you, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, like that's like my experience as well. I think that what you said, John, that was really interesting. Is just like that you see the church as a place that is for people like at their worst, and then like you also see socialism as something that like tries to deal with that problem. It's a cool negotiation of like the ways that Christianity and socialism work together. I was in graduate school when Occupy happened, so I guess it was a thing that I cared about for sure. Because I was like reading lots of social theory, but also I think my geographical sort of location made Occupy less important to me, just because I lived in the middle of nowhere and there wasn't like an Occupy encampment near me.
Where were you in grad school?
Yeah. I went to the University of Illinois in Springfield. So Springfield, Illinois is the capital of Illinois, actually, but it's also not very big, and I lived in even a smaller town just nearby. So I would drive home every day and like listen to NPR about what was ever happening at Occupy, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. Wish I could be there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that like I was living in Nashville at the time, but I'm not going to pretend that like I was actually engaged in it. But
Yeah,
we still talk about inequality because of
for sure.
Occupy. Like that they put something on the national radar in that way is still really impressive.
I mean, there's a sense in which like Occupy just like in life just happening, like it existing in the world and it being a thing that was going on. I mean, it's just like it was just like a philosophical text kind of playing out in the streets, like that made you think about income and debt and like everyone's disgruntlement and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I get it. It was important, right. Even though I wasn't there. I guess it was a thing I thought about. Yeah,
for me, it was like going from church putting me in proximity to people that are poor, and then this idea that like, the church ought to be concerned about that because it sucks. Like, I mean, it's horribly destructive. And then Occupy gave this like I said, it sort of blew it up for me into this grander scale that I just hadn't thought of before that. And it really was. I mean, I was working at a private Christian school teaching middle school students, And I don't remember what, like, I mean, at that point I like got to reading Marx's Capital, and so I would drive to the middle school. I was a sub, like I was a full-time sub, and I would drive to the middle school. I would listen to David Harvey's lectures on Capital, and then I would read the text while the kids were working on their homework.
Nice.
and then drive back and listen to it. And so it was sort of that combination. It was something like came together for me in that moment.
Yeah.
Of the sort of analytic side of Marx, where you're seeing like, oh, this is actually how capitalism works. But then actually caring about what it's doing to people and how those all just like fit together in that moment, to me was where, I mean, I would not have identified as a socialist, which is a relatively recent thing, but the all of that was happening right then.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool that was like the backdrop. I was reading Hart and Negri's Empire, and I was like, oh man, the multitude's happening. Sounds great.
Someday,
yeah.
Whatever the multitude is, it'll happen, I guess.
That's right, whatever it is. That's awesome.
So you were just saying, like, at that time you didn't identify as a socialist, but now you do. And I am very curious to know what your experience has been like being a socialist as a pastor of a church. So, you know, you were a Christian, you became a socialist, but now you're a real life pastor at a real life church doing stuff with real life average Christian folks. How does your congregation relate to your socialism?
That's a really good question. So some of it is, what's helpful is I'm 31, so some of it they can just kind of chalk it up to me being like, you know, young whippersnapper or whatever. Like, yeah, it's like a generational thing. And then also I don't know, like, I don't know what the sort of like Red Scare was like, but I think people, they've sort of lost the idea that of immediately associating socialism with like violent overthrow, and maybe, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, I don't know, but like, you know, that's sort of gone. So it's just like, oh no, it's, for me, being a socialist is about the democratic control of the productive apparatuses of society, and then the spread, the democratic spread of the wealth generated from people's work. And like, that's actually not that, like, people can disagree that that's a good thing or whatever, or like how that plays out, or why we should do that, or how we do that. But I found ways to just, you know, it really is about it. That's the goal. And then people, and I, like, I'm not a violent person, and I'm probably not even as revolutionary as I should be. So that's, so to some degree, like, that's part of it. That, you know, when you sort of plainly state that socialism is about, yeah, about democracy, it's about people having what they need. That's one way of navigating it that I've found. The other one is that just like Bernie is really popular, and whether or not he's a socialist, whatever, it has made people think about socialism in a different way, and it's eased people's tension.
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting to even think about. Sorry, my experience with church is so radically different. It's like such a funny idea to even think that there'd be someone who is like any type of political consciousness in charge, or a type of political consciousness that's not just incredibly reactionary. I mean, I get a lot of that in my life. I mean, you know, liberals and conservatives for sure, but I can't even imagine what it's like to have a socialist pastor. It's probably pretty rad. Are there any, like, have there been like any tense moments with your congregation where they've been like, oh man, that guy better not say that thing again? I don't know. It seems like that's probably a thing that might happen, but I don't really know. What's your experience been like?
I don't know. So there's like this whole thing of, I talked to us about it in like div school and stuff. This line of like, people won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Which I think is just something dumb people say, so that they don't have to actually know things. But there is something to that, like you do, like we can talk about ideas of the best ways to arrange society, but also like I would never let that stand in the way of like going to the hospital when someone is dying. Like those are my pastoral obligations, right? Like, and so
yeah,
that is. But oftentimes that's used to sort of like foreclose the discussion of ideas. Or not ideas is not the right term. Convictions, to like foreclose conversations about real convictions and organizing for different convictions. The other thing is like I sit in my young adult Sunday school class, and it's growing, and I'm there, and I'm pretty upfront about my political convictions and like what I want society to be like, and that group is growing, and they're there because they're pretty cool with me talking about those things. I've got a guy in the young adult group and like Sunday school group who's like Noam Chomsky, Marx, like he's pretty tentative about our church because we're not doing those things, and that's something I try to communicate to others within the church. It's like, oh yeah, this stuff is all up for grabs with the young adults that you want joining the church.
That's really interesting. So church leaders out there listening to this podcast, inevitably, I mean, they are probably out there. The reasons millennials are leaving the church is because you're not talking about socialism, I guess. That seems like right. The moral of that story.
It reminds me of that story of when the DSA was repairing people's brake lights. I don't know, why can't churches get on board with that?
Yeah, right?
Yeah, it's the left really wants a church, and the church, if you read the Bible, probably should be left, is my...
Someone needs to get like a Gospel Coalition article out that's like, why are the millennials leaving church? Because you don't read Acts 4:32 right.
That's right.
Yeah, but it's funny. Like, I don't know. I find that I talk about debt a lot to especially young or debt or like money or all this stuff, and it's just not taboo in the same way. And people, maybe it's because of Facebook and Twitter, and we're just, for better or worse, plugged into the way in which our political entertainment machinery is actually having this effect. But people just aren't scared of talking about this. At least younger people, and they want a space to do that, and people to do that around, but that connects with the faith that like for me, growing up in church was a pretty safe place around people that I knew that cared about me. So if you can combine those two or figure out ways to make them work together, let me know, because that's what I would like to do.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially to think back on my own experience as like a young person in the church trying to figure stuff out. I grew up Roman Catholic, but then I took like a really long detour through evangelicalism, and I had some very nice pastors and youth pastors that I loved, which is why I kept going to those churches and to those youth groups. But I can't imagine what I would be like now if one of those pastors had been like, yeah, and by the way, all those ideas that you're like struggling with in the Bible, socialists think about them. Like, that would be extremely helpful, actually, to have somebody kind of open to like guiding you through the material consequences of what you're actually reading in the Bible, instead of just like, I don't know, I guess like anytime I would bring up caring about poor people to like pastors when I was a teen or like a young adult, the response was always just something like, yeah, well, the Bible calls us to take care of the poor, and like that's the end of it. Like, you never get a kind of second reflection on that. So I don't know, do you find that young people in your church like really gravitate toward that? Does it feel like they are being kind of introduced to like new vocabularies through their church that allows them to interact with like the actual material world outside the church in a unique way? Like, I don't know, what's your read on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because what I try to resist as being too heavy-handed with things, and like I'm sure y'all see it on Facebook. Like, if you have enough sort of moderate liberal Christian friends, anything that like Trump does basically, and then they respond with like rewriting Matthew 25 and putting it into just, you know, like or rewriting some verse that then, yeah, it just, to me, I'm interested in the, like, even something beyond that, or like bigger than that Scripture is addressing, but that there's a political texture to Scripture that we often don't see, or don't take time to pay attention to, and then there's a theological texture to our world that we don't take time to see. So, like, you asked about like kind of younger people and youth. So, I'm really cautious about just telling the youth in our church, and maybe this, I'm really cautious about just saying like, oh, you should be a socialist.
Yeah, that's probably for the better, and also
right. Yeah.
It's a good reason that I'm not.
But I also, like, you know, one, like, I went to, my youth group was not nearly that effective in keeping my friends and I from like doing the things they didn't want us to do, right? But I do want them to see, like what you talked about, when they, and I relate to that too, like latching, when you recognize there's a care for, people that are suffering the ills of this systemic injustices of our society, like not rushing in to cover that up for them, or to make that just be okay, and actually saying, no, you should latch onto this, and you should understand it. Like, you're right, that is really messed up. So like my part of my job is working with the youth of our church, and I sort of just, I try to just eject all contemporary political economic vocabulary from what we talk about, but also to use the words of Scripture to show like, oh, this is about our real world. So we talked about the Virgin Mary for 4 or 5 weeks in youth group at a Baptist church, which was pretty cool. Yeah, and then we got to the Magnificat,
that was cool.
And we had 1 week where we just read it, and then I said, okay, so who in our world are the high and mighty? And these are like really, they're cool. Like, they see this stuff, and so the first answer was the UN Security Council.
Nice, wow, those are some woke teens you've got there.
Yeah, man.
Real woke teens. Oh, they sort of see their world, and I think some of this is like the internet. Like, they're taking stuff in a way that I was not. But it was like the rich. It was like these broad categories of I think they said immigration and ICE was one of them too. You know, and they said who are the lowly, and they said the poor, the homeless. I mean, they had about a dozen on each side, and they were just generally right, you know. So then the next week we're in a downtown church, and so the next week we did this exercise that I called Scripture in the Streets, and we walked. The bus stop is about 2 blocks from our church, so we walked over there, and we didn't like go into the bus stop, because that can be really. I mean, it can. There's no great way to take a group of students to do a kind of observational exercise like that, right? That's not a little bit weird, but we just kind of hung out across the street, and I said, okay, kind of spread out, and then what do you see? Like, what's going on here? And they had a couple questions, and then they had the text of the Magnificat, and I was like, which line stands out here? And Winston is a really weird city. I mean, it's like pretty much every city right now. It's becoming heavily gentrified, ton of inequality. Well, so we walked from the bus stop to the Wells Fargo building, because we have a ton, like Winston has a ton of finance, and then had them do basically the same exercise. Like, what do you see here? What's going on? And again, I didn't say socialism, capitalism. I didn't say even like rich or poor. But getting them to see that, you know, the language of Scripture helps them understand it is not about this sort of otherworldly. It is about an otherworldly thing, but that otherworldly thing informs how you see and the people that take the bus and the people that work at the Wells Fargo building. So that was like a long way to go, but again, but I could just give them and be like, okay, you should be a socialist because in terms of income and like you need income to pay for things, and everyone should be able to pay for these things, like, and that's where I hope they get. But to be able to map the language of Scripture onto their world, to me is really important, and that may be how you get there. There again, there's no like silver bullet.
I guess what your experiment reminds me of, to kind of a lesser but not less important degree necessarily, is the Gospel in Solentiname that we've been talking about on the podcast recently, where this Catholic priest in Nicaragua, Ernesto Cardenal, he had these peasants just read the biblical text and think about what it meant. And, kind of, he, I think, also had this kind of soft way of like leading them to, I guess, see the kind of critical and creative moments in the text that are interesting to read in a capitalist society. But the amazing thing is that these folks, these peasants, people who probably didn't read the Bible that much before an experiment like that, were, willing to use that language and those images and metaphors to name inequalities in their own time. I think it's really amazing to do that with students and church folks generally. Do you find that that's something that your students get really excited about? Do they like begrudgingly drag their feet, being like, I got to do this like class assignment, or like?
Well, that's something I'm also trying to avoid, because I think the way it would look like a class assignment is like, you have to get the right answers, and so that's something I've always, or since I've been working with students over the last few years, it's just like, you have to take their lives seriously, that like they can see these things and they can talk about these things. It's the same thing with, I think, millennials and young adults, is that so often we are it's not even like talked down to, because it's not condescension, it's I don't know, just like being preached at or taught as if we just don't know things. It's like, no, we're like actual people in the world, and we can see things that are going on. We may be right or wrong, but like come to it on that level, not you just don't know. And so, yeah, so I want to avoid, because that was kind of how I was brought up in youth group, which was, it was basically, here's how to study for the test, right? Like, these are the right answers about Christianity and God. Versus like, well, we're going to read the Bible, right, and we're going to talk about it. What do you see going on here? I mean, I certainly think there are like, right and good things to say, but I think that's part of it, is just shifting out of this mindset of being tested or being monitored or controlled with regards to the right answers to things. Which is interesting, because once you just I'll tweet the screenshot of the boards of like the stuff that they said were like the high and mighty and the lowly, because like, they're absolutely right. They were 100% right.
You're kind of coming out of this tradition where you're following kind of like your dad a little bit, and that's pretty neat. But there's, I guess, like a pretty long tradition of like radical preachers, radical pastors in the United States and elsewhere. Do you have any that kind of inform the way that you pastor your church? Is there a person, I guess, that like sticks out to you sort of historically that you think of as like a pastor role model in terms of like being a radical or being a socialist?
Besides Jerry Falwell, that is.
Yeah, big Jer.
Clearly,
it's my guy. Yeah,
big
guy did not. Yeah, he really stood opposed to the cultural No, I don't know. I mean, I guess Will Campbell, like if y'all have ever read Will Campbell, Brother to a Dragonfly, is a really great book, and I kind of hate the way that it gets co-opted into a really nice liberalism, but when you think about what he was actually doing, so Will Campbell was a Baptist preacher who was one of the only white people invited to pretty significant moments in organizing opportunities of the civil rights movement, but he also was going and preaching to the KKK that they ought to repent, but doing so in a way that he thought they might be able to hear. But I think he has this great story about him where he was at Riverside Church in New York, which is the Rockefellers built, and this beautiful ornate sanctuary, and he was there in the 80s, and he kind of made this name for himself about having an understanding of race and racism that a lot of white people didn't. And so then by the 80s he's getting invited to all these liberal places to make them feel better about whatever it was they were doing about racism. Just what happens. And he's preaching there and said, you all asked me to be here to say what should we do about the racial crisis. And he says, I've been to enough of these things that I know that what you really mean is, what should we do about the racial crisis? And then he kind of looks around and goes, and keep all of this. And that's hung with me since I read it several years ago, because I think that's where a lot of churches are at. Or what? I mean, with the still ongoing racial crisis that exists in America, but also just with what we're dealing with in terms of capitalism and the systemic injustice that we see. And I think a lot of churches are asking, what can we do about this and keep all of this? Whether that's a building or sort of my commitments or my theological frameworks. It's how can we change things but also keep everything okay?
No, I think that's pretty solid though. Yeah, I really like that turn. I think that's actually a pretty helpful way about thinking about convicting people in general, convicting Christians, because there is a real sense that Christians want to see that actual really good Christian change in the world that Jesus talks about, but at the same time they want to do it without upsetting the status quo. They don't want to actually change anything, or they don't want to have to lose their building or lose their job or change the type of work they do or anything else, right? It's about how can we get justice while making sure we're still okay,
right?
Which I'm sympathetic to. I mean, I don't know that I want to sacrifice a whole lot in my life. I don't have a whole lot to lose. I think where it may be different is when you can see people who have a certain level of material comfort that it might be okay to lose a little bit of it, or just you're not asking a whole lot.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, actually, I want to ask you a little bit about the kind of thing that you've been doing with debt in churches and maybe in your church community. Sorry. Because I think that question of debt is exactly that, right? How much are people willing to lose? How much are they willing to put at stake, I guess, in the interest of some kind of speculative game that may or may not actually pan out? And then once people get screwed by having so much debt, how much is their community willing to lose to kind of help other members of that community get out of debt or something like that? It seems like personal finance and individual finance in the United States is so ideologically built into our DNA that people are afraid to ask for help or be open about their debt. And it seems like churches have kind of a potentially unique role to play. I mean, in a lot of cases have something like a common purse. In a lot of cases, they have ways of, formally like redistributing the wealth of their community. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like, what's your work on debt been like as a pastor, as a church member?
So far, it's been just talking about it a lot, but I mean that has a kind of value in just opening up, like the forcing it to people to recognize that, like, oh, this is normal for people now. That, like, taking out these massive, like, the people that you see in church, particularly ones that are younger or have gone to college, well, just anybody, everybody's in debt. We have a low income housing project directly across the street from the church, and these would be the people that, like, Deleuze says are too poor for debt, right? Like, but even then, like, they get behind on a bill or something like that, and they're in debt and at risk of getting evicted. So it's just affecting everyone, and it's the thing that everyone that I know, all my friends, are thinking about. It was a study or a survey where they asked millennials, like, what are you more frequently scared of, debt or death? And they said debt.
That's like the worst riff on that Seinfeld joke of, like, people who are more afraid of public speaking than dying. Yeah. Like, you'd rather be giving the eulogy at a funeral or you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. It's like you'd rather be in the casket than singing along.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just sort of there. So I've just found, like, well, there's no reason to not be talking about this, because everyone knows everyone's dealing with it, and it is a significant thing in everyone's life. Like, we're all trying to figure it out. And the sort of answers to it are so paltry compared to the problem.
Well, there's a thing that you tweet about, or that you've posted about on various platforms, not just Twitter, but Twitter, where you talk a lot about, like, finance and, like, sort of the culture that surrounds it, like, for personal finance, and it's interesting to start thinking about, like, that weird, like, hush culture, or, like, the sort of, like, the manners of finance. Like, you can't talk about how much money you make, and you can't talk about your economic situation, and it's not polite to talk about debt and all of these things. And that's, like, that is such a dumb sort of, like, prohibition that only serves one side of the class war. Like, not having those conversations, I think, is, well, I mean, it's, like, not being transparent, and it's, like, leaving, like, a huge portion of your life, like, just hidden away. And I think that's really sucky. So I don't know, the whole thing about finance and sharing where you're at with debt and money is really important. And if you can share it with your community, your church community specifically, that's kind of amazing.
It is funny. I mean, I think don't share about where you're at financially. There's certainly shame around it for all of us that are in debt, but I think it's more about protecting the people that aren't. Right? Like, I think it's protecting their feelings.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like, that to me seems like something you ought to be willing to give up if you're a Christian. Your sort of your own feelings about your own finances or other people's finances. So I'm certainly open with talking about it. And then, like, Dean, you were saying, I mean, does the church have institutional resources that could be used to alleviate the fear that people have more than death? And I think we do, and I'm working on some of those things at my church of how could we create a kind of common pool that would go to help pay off people's debt. And other churches have done this. So this is not totally new or innovative, but really I've found even just conversation about it, it opens up. It opens people up in a particular, because then you're talking about the hours that people work and why they do or don't come to church, and then you're talking about, like, worry, like what they're most concerned about, and then they're talking about like what do they hope for in their life, right? Like what is this holding them back from? And I mean, that's what church should be, right? The place where you can actually go do those things.
It's funny because I always think about those couple of bits in Acts 2 and 4. Like, the only real information that we get about the early church, apart from like some vague like stuff about them singing hymns and stuff, is like they sold all their stuff and then they held everything together. It's like you can't get more primitive in your Christianity than like primitive wealth sharing. I feel like it seems like it should be an easy sell to people at church. Like I don't know, what if we redistributed our wealth among ourselves to help folks in our community who are having a hard go of it or have been or whatever? That seems like a pretty good way to get people to come to your church, or like a good way to like.
It was a great church growth strategy in Acts. Then thousands were added to their number. They really did it.
Yeah,
2018 doing
right.
it.
That's right.
No, I mean, well, but I think it's, some of it like speaks to just the ideology of capitalism and like how much it's worked its way into it. Is that like I'll bring up basically what you just said, Dean, right? Like we should just like pay this stuff off for people in whatever capacity. And I've done this in a couple and different ways with like benevolence fund and stuff like that at different churches. But then the recoil is like, well, then they'll just come to church because they're like self-interested and they just want to get something out of it. Which I don't know. I went to youth group because I was like trying to like see cute girls and stuff for like 6 years. There's worse reasons to go to church than these people care enough about me to pay off my debt, which is the most terrifying thing in my life, right? Like,
I mean, people do the dumbest things to get people to go to church. Like, oh, we have a Starbucks in our church. Like, no, pay their debts. That'll get them in the door. God.
Right. Yeah, so I don't think it could be purely like a sort of church growth strategy, but also it is something that's so, it's such a big step that you wouldn't be doing it if you didn't care. Like you have to care. Like you have to, and it probably has to be people that you see around. Because like, I try to, any GoFundMe that comes up on Facebook or whatever, try to just like give $5 or whatever. Like, because you just should. I don't know. You just should. And it'd be great if we had a social system that we didn't have to have it come up on our Facebook, and people also just didn't have to go into debt or have horrifying medical expenses.
Go tithe me, if you will.
Right, yeah.
Oh my God.
Right. Yeah, but like I think people do actually want that, and that is something that the church offers as a way of thinking about your relationship with other people. That extends beyond just it's a way of institutionalizing care for other people.
Yeah.
That once you've done that, you could expand it, right? Like you could go beyond this community of 100 or 200 or however many people, and then you're looking at something like socialism, right? Like you're looking at a system where people are cared for without the immediate need of individual attention.
I think, John, the point you made about the ideology of liberalism, I think is so good there, though, that like that's like kind of the prohibition that's what keeps us from getting going that direction. Even like I remember, so I went to like a Nazarene church growing up, and that's all I want to say about that. It was Nazarene. There's like nothing else relevant about that story. I went to one though, and I remember like the types of rhetoric and language that people would use to kind of describe their situations, or like how they would kind of like announce their situations to the congregation, or make known that they're having a hard time. And it would be like, people would say things just like, well, just having a really hard time lately, but just giving it all to God. And it's like, no, you're actually suffering like economically, like you're having a difficult time. Like I just remember being like a teenager in a youth group and like being like what is actually happening in your life and how can I help you? That was like the internal dialogue. Not, I wouldn't scream that in but because like Christianity is just like a broad religious movement with lots of different facets, like it can be informed and conform to liberal ideology. And I think that like when we just say we're going to give it all to God instead of actually fixing those problems or actually like finding ways to take care of one another in serious ways, we just, I don't know, fall apart.
Yeah, I Stanley Hauerwas, who's a theologian and professor at Duke, has this, I mean, really fun little saying that like if the church doesn't exist, God doesn't exist. And I think I take that to heart. That like, well, yeah, if this isn't real, then let's just pack. Like, why are we even here? And so the like latching on to those moments of like, I mean, certainly there is a point at which human beings and human communities in the face of oppression, there is no answer, right? Like like either God is real or just we're screwed. But particularly in the churches that I have grown up in and been in, there's a lot of slack to be made up before you get to that point, right? Like there's a lot of things that I could be giving up that I'm not, and that we as a collective community could be doing or giving up that we're not yet, and that's the point at which I want to get to. Does that make sense? I think that's kind of what you're like. Yeah, we could do something about this.
Yeah. It just means like reading the Lord's Prayer in like a really serious way. Like forgiving one another's debts means like doing it.
Really doing
2018, just doing it. Just doing it for real.
So I want to go back to this issue of relationships, though, because you bring it up in a different context in your Medium blog, which I am a faithful reader of, and which the rest of you should be as well. It is very good. You're a very good Medium blogger. I will say that, John. So you recently wrote this post about the transforming power of relationships is sort of the shorthand that you used. And I really liked it. The short of it, for folks who haven't seen it or read it, is that there's this kind of idea in many Christian communities that kind of keeps them from thinking about socialism, or I guess maybe functions as like a knee-jerk reaction against socialism, where people say, and I've heard this like a million times, like, well, I think, the church should be the place where all these things happen, and if we just like had our relationships in order and we just like encountered each other, then we would really take care of each other. And of course the irony is that like empirically that isn't happening. So I think it's great that you exactly. You really challenge that, I think, by saying, there's more to the world than just, I don't know, two people refusing to shake hands on like a Sunday morning or something. So why do you think that Christians are kind of prone to this idea that like in some kind of imaginary community or something, everyone's nice to each other and that solves all the world's inequalities? Why do you think Christians are prone to that? And how do you think that like we could communicate maybe a more kind of expansive materialist understanding of why these relationships exist for Christians?
I think some of it is historically just like vacating politics from the Bible. So like there's just no or from theology, or just that just politics. I mean, it's Margaret Thatcher, right? Like there is no such thing as society. That's right. What a lot of people believe, is that there's no such thing as society. Like there's nothing beyond your friends, your family, and your church, or whatever kind of community you can name. And I think Christians just bought into that. That great Kevin Kruse book, One Nation Under God, right? Like he documents this really well about how this kind of libertarian ideology wedded itself with Christianity and churches politically to do this. And so like a lot of moderate to sort of liberal, I mean, conservative churches definitely think there's something called society and that it ought to function in a very particular way. But the counter to that hasn't been, oh no, that there is something called society or the state, and it should function in a particular way, and it should be this way that's opposite that. It's been to say, no, we actually just don't do politics. We don't talk about politics, anything beyond the community. So yeah, so I wrote that. It's really funny because I like wrote that post, and it's about how like relationships actually don't really function in the way that we think they do. Because it's basically like, oh, if you go tutor a poor black kid and you're like a rich white person, that'll do it. Like that will not only will that do it, like
right.
it will. It's not just that that's enough, but that will actually lead to change. That it spells out this kind of formula. If you encounter someone in a relational way, in a relationship, I hate the term relational. I don't know why I said it. If you encounter someone in a relationship, in a social way, that will then change how you think about things, which will then change how you act at whatever level of power that you have. And that will then have an effect on changing the world. And it is liberalism, which is if enough individuals do the right thing at the right time without any coordination or organization, things will work out. And so, so I do actually think there is transforming power in relationships, just not as it's pitched to us. I don't hear anybody who like, or I hear few people who become friends with someone who's homeless and then question private property, right? Like, right? Which would be a very transformative thing, right? It's mostly it's kind of that Will Kid. It's like, how can I have this relationship and then also keep all of this? And that to me is that. But the power of the gospel is that, like, well, no, you don't. You can lose all of this and you still have life. And that there is a community that will be okay with that. That will help you through that. That recognizes it's okay to lose things, but we are here to help you through that. To show you that we think Jesus is real and is stronger than the strongest thing in your life. And so, yeah, so that post was like really about the way that phrase, the transforming power of relationship, really quickly gets co-opted into keeping things the way that they are. And I think a lot of it's that all we really have is our thought life and the people we can see, because the systems that we exist in have just won so thoroughly. So what else do you have, right? You just have you become friends with people and you change the way you think, and then you hope that'll change things. And it hasn't worked.
But that's like, I guess that's why like materialist analysis is so helpful for Christians, is because like you can do that part of it and that's awesome. But then like once you understand like the fetishized commodity or like reification or whatever, then you can kind of understand like the deeper material relationships that are separating you from other people or
really
abstracting relationships in different ways. So like, I don't know, Christians, get at it.
Yeah, I
really
don't know how we really do it. No, but I do think, I mean, because like one of the things I have been, we talked about at my church, mitigating poverty. And so I've tried to talk about, okay, so that means getting people, whether it's a person or a group of people, like raising their income above the poverty level. Like that's what you're talking about. And so we can actually measure that and we can see it. And which I think gets to your point about like material analysis, because that would lead to better material, hopefully lead to better material outcomes. And people just like people back off from that. Well, no, we're talking about more than that. I'm like, no, that's just what we're talking about. We're talking about mitigating poverty.
It's like a pretty big thing in itself.
People's income getting above the poverty level. That's what it is. Right. Yeah. See, it is right there. Yeah. And so I do believe in the transforming power of relationships, in that they can powerfully they can and ought to transform how we think about everything, but it means you actually are required to question everything, and that's not how it's usually pitched. I think is it Dorothy Soleil who's like, you become a socialist if you're a Christian because you love your neighbor and then you just question everything.
Yeah, that's good.
I think that's pretty much right. I think that's probably how I want to.
We're coming up to the top of our hour together. Maybe we could ask at the end here, like for other pastors who are, I don't know, maybe trying to think about how to integrate their faith and their politics in their church community. Are there particular things that you feel like have been going really well for you? Are there issues that you're struggling with that you, I guess, want to see other pastors working on as well? I don't know. What's it like to kind of think that through, knowing there are other pastors also hopefully kind of coming to these similar challenges?
Oh, I'm gonna get fired as soon as this airs, so don't. Yeah. You know, I kind of see, I don't know, maybe like two things. One, I see, and a lot of this is just on social media, but also in my relationship with other ministers, is this recoil towards a kind of defensiveness and like a if your pastor isn't preaching about X, then you need to find a new church. And X is always like a really bad thing. Like, and things are really bad. I'm not trying to say things aren't like really bad right now. But what I think people really need right now in churches is a positive vision of what their life could be like. In like Matt, you were saying, like material terms. That like this is, we understand that this is the thing that is really frightening to you. Everyone I know is a job loss and a hospital visit away from being in complete financial ruin. And so I where I find hope in churches is that we can actually answer that. Like I was saying, you know, for some reason it became ingrained in me that like church is the place you go when you bottom out, and people are bottoming out right now, and to some degree to like ignore the stuff that's flying at us all the time in the like bigger picture, right? Like that stuff's there, and I don't know how to deal with it. But to get to the bottom of like the stuff that people are just really scared of, and find a way to address that not just in word but in a sort of communal and institutional sense, because that's kind of, churches are the last weird things. Like you can kind of do what a community wants in a church, and that's not an experience anybody has in any of their institutions. None of it. All of us are subject to our workplaces. We're all subject to just being told basically what to do, and you can't change, and nobody really thinks it's working for them. But a church actually could. And I don't know if we'll do it, but I don't know where else to go. I really don't know what other institution or community beyond like a half dozen people that could actually stave off some of these things that are really troubling people, and that are really destroying people's lives, and then actually be for them and for their lives. So that's what we should be thinking about and looking for, and it doesn't look like sermons that are just condemning the latest bad thing, but that are actually calling forth a better world on the large.
That good to me.
Dang, that's like a really good pitch for church, though. That's that
I will show up that Sunday.
Like, yeah, no, for real. But like, if everything else, like, I mean, like you said, right? I mean, like in our everyday life, we're beholden to banks, and we're beholden to our job and our debt that will follow us around even if we die or whatever, right? Church is the thing that exists that like doesn't. It's actually wild to think about that, like. Well, I mean, like our life is so fundamentally mediated by capital and the relationships of exchange,
yeah,
and like church isn't.
Yeah, it's usually not. It's and you can just show up. Like it's the weirdest thing. It's like it's one of the last like voluntary organizations. I had a friend, leftist from Duke, who was in the literature. She was like, "How do churches earn money?" And I was like, "People just show up literally every week, and they put money in a plate." And it didn't feel weird to me to say that until I was like, the words were coming out of my mouth. But yeah, it is one of like the only spaces that you can show up in. It's kind of weird, and you just don't know what it could be. And I'm not like trying to say all churches are good or that we aren't beholden to the kind of ideologies that are working our world, but we don't have to be. And I don't know. I don't know what that will look like, but there's at least a possibility there with church that I don't see happening anywhere else.
Yeah, keep Christianity weird. 2018. 20IMAGIN18.
Really doing it.
Really getting it done. Really getting it imagined.
Really
doing it. I cannot remember it for the life of me. I think I've said it 3 different ways, so. That's fine.
Doing it,
hey,
really.
I'm really doing that. I'm really changing it up. 2018, change it up.
That's good. That's a good subtitle to 2018.
Yeah.
2018,
yeah,
colon,
like it.
really doing it,
colon Tokyo Drift.
Cool. Well, thanks, John, for coming on the show. Find John on Twitter at John Thornton Jr.
Is that how Twitter works?
.com?
I don't think that's how Twitter works.
No.
Also, your Medium, which I presume is findable via your Twitter, but the Medium is good.
Thanks.
Check it out.
Thanks, guys. This has been really fun.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. Thanks again to John for all that cool stuff you just did and joining us for a conversation. Special thanks to Amari Armstrong for those real dope beats at the beginning. And also thanks for the song at the end here, To the Illogical Spoon, because we use it all the time. And like we said last time, didn't ask them. Cool. If you liked what you heard here, you should go follow us on Twitter to hear, see more funny Christian communist related content. You can follow us on Facebook. You can get in our Facebook group, the Magnificast Basement. A lot of people have been enjoying that lately, but we haven't really had much of a conversation there yet. Maybe that'll turn around in the next few weeks. Or maybe it won't. Who knows?
Really doing it.
Really doing it. 2018. Cool. Also, you can follow us on SoundCloud, subscribe to us on iTunes. Subscribing to us on iTunes would be great. Giving us those reviews. That's how we keep those good goofs at the beginning coming, is your good reviews. So, cool. Anyways, here's the Illogical Spoon. See you next time.
Then we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. You keep your hoods up, and you stay up late. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up, and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Besides, what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was blowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said, I only know what I feel right now. I said, poet lies, sometime come true. Stay away from me, where see what we can do. Poet lies, sometime come true. Stay away from me, where see what we can do in my town. I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. This the kind of town folks get stuck in. Yeah, people get stuck here, but I chose to stay. If you ever want to know something, or know someplace, you just can't know them all. At some point, you must make a choice and choose someplace and make a home. There was a time not long ago when we look out this window and see a wolf pack running free. Except there'd be no window or this building separating us from all the life we see. Behold, the Lord makes all things new, and that sounds good, I want to do it too. Oh dear God, destroy my city, make it a place that wolves think pretty. So when I come back here and stay, I want to hear them howl someday. In my lifetime, in my place, before my body's down in the grave. Before my body's down in the grave, in my place. I don't want to get up for church in the morning, church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.
I don't want to get up for church in the morning, church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. I don't want to get up for church in the morning, church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside.
Well,
there we'll swim with all creation.
Keep your hoods
never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.
We're all a bunch of hoodlums. See, the skies are always gray, just like the ground of post-industry ruins we grew up around. Hope to my neighbors, family and old friends. Hope to all desperate and beat down, and beat down. We're all beat down. Of the dying are trying to rise from the sprawl. Souls of wounded sing hoarsely if they can at all. We all love leaves color, sweet ciders of the fall, till it turned to technique perfecting winter on. Whole earth now is all one big subdivision. Icy cold, though I'm told can be melted by God. We drove looking but slept and went into a ditch. Walked by and God's house, couldn't tell which was which. Oh, if only I knew where God's house was fine, I would lie on the couch and then speak on my mind. What do we do? Just watch as this whole world gets worse. Now we're told, blessed are those souls who for justice thirst, but that you'll quench this, they all told me. Be sure you're the one to start the fire for your fire so pure. I don't want to go out like no prophets of Baal. Seatbelt never showed up, though they danced in the yell. Yeah, I know I'm afraid of what my words imply. Deep down I'm not ready to face up to your fire. mercy me, may it be holy thee. We all need you, you know us, I hope. That's a grove of oak leaves where faith's fire could blow. But it's so hard out here in the cold, when it seems all we do is just wait and get old. It's so hard out here in the cold, when it seems all we do is just wait